Thanks to everybody who has taken time out of their busy schedules to join us today. As Will mentioned, the thrust of this session is really to help attempt to address how investors can identify the big picture issues that influence absolute returns. Joining us on this discussion today will be an industry builder, an asset manager, and an asset owner. And in that particular order, we'll have Steve Leidenberg, the CEO and founder of the Investment Integration Project, Carol Leibel, the CEO of Domini Impact Investments, and Steve Godeke, the founder of Godeke Consulting and the board vice chair at the Jesse Smith Noyce Foundation. So over the next hour or so, we are going to cover a number of items. We'll start off, I'll explain a little bit about what TIP is focused on, what we're doing, and why we focus on systems. Steve Leidenberg will frame the issue and provide key findings from TIP's latest report on systems-level considerations in the long-term investor, definitions, examples, and actions. We'll then get the investor perspective from Carol and Steve Godeke, with Carol representing a leading asset manager that is heading in the systems-level considerations direction, and Steve representing both a key advisor but also a asset owner that is beginning to integrate systems-level considerations. We'll then open up the floor to Q&A from participants, come back to discuss how TIP is helping investors chart similar courses to Domini and to Jesse Smith Noyce. And then we'll open it up to final wrap-up and final thoughts from Steve Squared and Carol, and have a little bit of insights on where folks can go to learn more in terms of systems-level considerations. So to start us off, a bit about TIP. So we were established not too long ago, in 2015. And we focus on helping institutional investors understand the big picture or systems level context of their portfolio level decisions. And by big picture or systems level, we're focusing on environmental, societal, and financial systems, a point that Steve Leidenberg will return to during his remarks. Our kind of key audience, we're focused on asset owners ranging from pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and endowments, to asset managers such as mutual fund companies, bank trust departments, and family offices. Our Tipping Points 2016 report, a State of the Industry analysis that looked at 28 asset owners and 22 asset managers, is a pretty good spot to see kind of that broad cut and really what all this kind of thinking looks like in action in terms of who we're focusing on. Finally, what does TIP provide? TIP provides market analysis, resources and tools, a database, measurement and reporting tools, working groups, and we host a number of convenings such as next week with the PRI in New York. So all of this focus on systems, all of these activities that we're engaging in, it really does raise that question. Why do we spend so much time helping investors think about these big picture or systems level context of their investments? Well, we basically start with the basic premise that stable systems promote healthy market returns just as surely as unstable environments can lead to reduced or negative market returns. So let's play that out with a real-world illustration. Let's talk about the financial system and how we came so close to complete meltdown on September 15th, 2008. While the worst-case scenario was avoided, the collapse that day of Lehman Brothers with its $600 billion in assets helped trigger a worldwide economic crisis. Some 6 million people lost their jobs, the Dow plunged 5,000 points, cash-strapped banks needed government bailouts, General Motors and Chrysler declared bankruptcy, and the U.S. unemployment rate skyrocketed to almost 10%, all because very smart people making rational decisions to boost portfolio returns turned a blind eye to the systemic risks they were creating. Similarly, in the early 2010s, speculators in the global commodities markets for staples such as wheat and corn, along with oil and fertilizer, helped drive the price of basic foods such as wheat and rice to levels so unsustainable for the world's poor that they provoked food riots and arguably contributed to the social unrest that ultimately ignited the Arab Spring with its subsequent failures of states and its regional geopolitical instability. So how will current systems level issues like these or climate change, access to fresh water, millennial youth unemployment, mass migrations, and a continued lack of transparency in the financial markets actually play out? Are our global systems, as they currently exist, resilient enough to withstand shocks created when any one of these issues reaches a tipping point? Can investors withstand tumultuous market conditions? In a world that's growing ever more connected, long-term investors will increasingly have to contend with these issues. Hence, the focus of this webinar and the report it relates to: how investors can identify the big picture issues that influence absolute returns. To address this dilemma, I'll now turn the floor over to Steve Leidenberg to review the key findings from TIP's latest report on systems-level considerations and the long-term investor, definitions, examples, and actions. Steve, you want to take it away?
Great. Thank you, Bill. I'll now turn our attention to the report itself. This report was written for investors with long-term investment horizons. And it asks the fundamental question: what is the role of systems, environmental, societal, and financial systems, in their investment practice, and how can they identify those systems that are most relevant to themselves? The report starts from the assumption that over the long haul, these systems help provide one of the most important elements of investment returns. That is, one of the primary sources of returns is the market itself, and the economy, which derives its ability to thrive from stability and prosperity of the environment, the society, and the financial markets. And as Bill pointed out, when these systems break down, as they did in 2008, there is no place to hide. And when these systems pose incalculable uncertainty, as climate change does today, investment decision-making becomes extremely difficult. By contrast, when these systems are stable, when they are preserved and enhanced, they can create a rising tide for all investors. They are essentially common pooled resources that we all depend on, and the preservation of which is crucial to our long-term success. So next slide. The report begins by noting that there is an increasing interest in issues related to these systems, to environmental sustainability, to social well-being, and to the stability of the financial system. This increased interest takes two forms. First is an increased interest in ESG integration, the incorporation of environmental, social, and governance concerns at the security and portfolio levels. The Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and Project Delphi have all developed metrics for security-specific and industry-level ESG integration. And at a portfolio level, we are now seeing organizations such as CDP develop tools that make possible the carbon footprinting of portfolios. And in addition, Morningstar has started rating individual funds on their overall sustainability characteristics. Second, institutional investors are increasingly being called upon to act with whole systems in mind. Stewardship is the watchword of the International Corporate Governance Network's Global Stewardship Principles, which call out systems-level risks and rewards explicitly. The Principles for Responsible Investment will be focusing on nine priority conditions for a sustainable financial system over the next 10 years, and the UN Environmental Programme's Financial Initiative is in the midst of a major project to design the financial system we need. We understand that systems-level thinking is important because we understand that there is a kind of feedback loop between day-to-day portfolio management and the functioning of these systems, and that these systems have an ability to impact our portfolios. Moreover, it is not an accident that these concerns are arising now. They are a direct reflection of the increasingly populous and complex world we live in and of the increasing impact of global finance. Given the importance of systems, the report asks, what are the systems that it is most appropriate and productive for long-term investors to focus on? And how might they be identified and defined? And what are some specific examples? These questions are important because if too narrowly conceived, an issue may be no more than a matter of personal preference with no true impact at systems levels, or could blind investors to important financial considerations, or could entail conflicts of interest or the appearance of such conflicts. The question of how to appropriately identify systems-level considerations and what are examples of such systems is therefore what we have set out to answer here. The report identifies 4 general guidelines that can be helpful: consensus, relevance, effectiveness, and uncertainty. Consensus assures that an issue is of general concern and not one that is simply personal or idiosyncratic. Relevance assures that it is a concern that has long-term implications for investors. Effectiveness assures that institutional investors have the ability to exercise influence at the system levels. And uncertainty assures that we are talking about issues with the potential for widespread disruption that affects the fundamental functioning of these systems. Consensus means that widespread debate of the broadest possible sort has taken place, a kind of public reasoning that typically finds its expression on a global scale with respected organizations. The broader that consensus, the stronger the case is for consideration. Relevance means a substantial likelihood that the issue will impact financial performance positively or negatively across multiple asset classes over long periods of time. The greater that likelihood, the stronger the case. Effectiveness means the potential for long-term investors to influence the system. Exercising influence takes up time and resources, and they should be spent well. The greater that potential, the stronger the case. And finally, the greater the uncertainty about the nature and degree of disruption a systems-level issue is likely to introduce, and the more that instability is of an incalculable nature, the more likely the issue is to be reasonable for consideration. So, what are examples of systems-level issues that meet these requirements? The report gives 2 examples for each of the environmental, societal, and financial systems. So, for environment, we looked at climate change, an obvious choice, and also at access to water, an issue to which institutional investors are paying increasing attention. Ceres, for example, has now in process its Water Hub, a working group of institutional investors seeking tools for the integration of water risks. The World Resources Institute has developed its global water risk measurement tool, Aqueduct. The importance of access to fresh water is clearly an issue on which there is broad consensus. United Nations recently declared access to water as a basic human right. Clearly, managing this risk has far-reaching financial implications across multiple industries, and assuring access to water is vital to economic development. Opportunities to invest in water-related solutions for investors are many. They are varied, and they are increasing. And finally, no one really knows how serious and disruptive the loss of access to water will be to the hundreds of millions of people in South Asia and Southeastern Asia if and when the glaciers of the high Tibetan mountains disappear, or if major aquifers around the world upon which agriculture depends starts to run dry. In the societal sphere, we looked at labor and human rights, along with well-being in the form of poverty alleviation and access to health care. Human rights and labor rights have long been recognized as crucial to peace and stability. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated in 1948 as a direct response to the chaos of World War II, and the International Labor Organization was formed in 1919 in direct response to the unrest that led up to World War I. The unpredictable risks to whole societal systems that human rights and labor abuses may lead to can be profoundly disrupting to investment and indeed to trust in the entire market system. And both issues are those on which investors' voice can be effectively heard. Finally, for financial systems, I don't have to remind anyone who lived through 2008 about the importance of stability to the financial markets. Stability is one of the two examples the report examines. The other is transparency. That is, the importance of having reliable data available in the financial markets. Increased reliability of data was one of the primary impetuses for passage of the Securities Act of 1933, which itself was a response to the 1929 stock market crash and related abuses. That the World Federation of Exchanges has now proposed voluntary guidelines for the disclosure of ESG data for stock exchanges around the world is just one sign of the increasing relevance of this data for investors and of the uncertainty with which they must contend when making decisions in its absence. So these are three examples of systems-level issues that the report identifies as reaching the level of reasonableness for consideration by long-term investors. There are obviously others. One source of such issues that generally fall into this category is the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, with a number of with issues relevant to a number of long-term investors, ranging from the Dutch pension fund, PGGM, to U.S. impact investing firm Sonnen Capital, which are starting to align their investment strategies with these goals. So identifying such systems-level issue is only one of the challenges that needs to be resolved if long-term investors are to be able to intentionally seek to manage their risks and rewards with regards to system-level considerations. For that reason, TIP is also turning its attention to questions of what the specific policies and practices are that long-term investors are beginning to adopt to address these issues. Particularly challenging is the question of how one's influence, one's impact at systems levels can be measured and evaluated, and how long-term investors can report on the steps they are taking to tackle these challenges. Moreover, when confronting systems-level risks and rewards, no one investor, no one party alone can truly have influence. Questions of collaborative action in the management of these pooled resources for wealth generation will inevitably arise. To review the key points, long-term investors have considerable interest in taking environmental, societal, and financial systems level considerations into account. 4 guidelines can be helpful in determining which of many possible systems level issues these investors might most appropriately and usefully focus on. They are consensus, relevance, effectiveness, and uncertainty. And in addition, more research on measurement needs to be done, as well as further elaboration of how investors can best report on their systems level policies and practices. It is through addressing issues such as these, along with questions such as that of the definition of these systems, as we have done in this report, that genuine progress can be made in these important areas. So with that, by way of background on the report, I'll now return the presentation back over to Bill.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. So what we'd like to do now is complement the kind of industry building perspective that you just expressed with the investor perspective. In this particular case, with Carol Leibel from Domini Impact Investments, who represents one of the leading asset managers that is beginning to integrate systems level considerations in their investment process. as well as Steve Godegi, who, in addition to being an advisor to all sorts of asset owners and managers, is the vice chair of the board of the Jesse Smith Noyce Foundation, a leading asset owner that has committed 100% towards mission in terms of its assets and is beginning to consider systems level considerations. So I'd like to pause there and maybe start with Carol and say, how did this frameworks report that Steve just detailed, how does this resonate with your own perspective and the work you guys are doing at Domini? And how are you guys starting to think about systems? And maybe just as you start to respond to that, give everyone a little bit of background on who Domini is, or the kind of organization it is, and its work in the field.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to participate and speak about some of the work that Domini has done. Domini is an SEC registered investment advisor. We've been exclusively focused on responsible investing since 1991. And as you can imagine, this work has resonated very well with our organization. We have, through the years, of course, devoted many resources to thinking about important social and environmental issues, which have included the health of the systems that are so critical to portfolio success. In fact, if you look at our two fundamental goals, ecological sustainability and universal human dignity, those would be defined by TIP as systems goals. But the TIP's work has really demonstrated the need for investors to move beyond the management of ESG risks and rewards at simply a portfolio level, and to really think about considering and addressing the health of the system that the portfolio relies on. So I think there have been many investors thinking about systems on the fringe, but that there's been this struggle to connect this feedback loop between the portfolio and the systems. And I think, Steve's examples and demonstration really help bring that to life for all of us. So TIP's work is really helping to create this clear connection of why it should matter, systems should matter to investors at a portfolio level, and why it's important for long-term investors to think about. So it was really just simply, I think, the aha moment that we all needed. So at Domini, that aha moment drove us to launch a new initiative on impact measurement and communication of that with our investors. And then in doing that, we would incorporate systems level consideration reporting. So we began our work on this endeavor in about July of 2016. At the core, we started with our two twin goals, as I previously mentioned, people on the planet. And from there, we built out 6 systems that we were seeking to positively influence with our portfolios, while also simultaneously seeking to generate competitive financial returns. TIP's most recent occasional paper really provides us now with guidelines to determine the relevance of the systems that we've identified for integration into our investment process. These guidelines offer us an independent framework to complete our assessment. So as a demonstration of some of the work that we're doing and getting ready to begin publishing, so for example, within our goal of universal human dignity, we have defined biodiversity as a system critical to portfolios. Within biodiversity, we're seeking impact on the topic of extinction. And we've chosen to focus on ocean life within that impact. and there we get even more specific with a focus of a goal of sustainable seafood. So to summarize and really follow the chain, it's our desire to impact biodiversity, positive influence at the systems level that ultimately leads us to work on sustainable seafood. With that, I'll wrap it up. So.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think getting into that kind of granular level of the particular kinds of systems that you're thinking about, as well as how you guys are beginning to frame them out, is extremely helpful. And what I'd like to do is bring Steve Godeke into this now, as someone who kind of sits at a number of different intersections within the space, not just on the board of Jesse Smith Noyce, but also as an advisor and a thought leader in the space. Maybe talk a little bit about how Steve's paper in general, how that resonated with a lot of what you're seeing in the field, but also specifically how you guys are thinking about systems level considerations at Jesse Smith Noyce.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. At Jesse Smith Noyce, we're a private foundation working to promote social justice, so we're taking on systems issues like structural racism, gender inequality, and all forms of discrimination. The bulk of our day-to-day activity is grant making and grassroots movement building, and we recognize or try to work that there's this special role for diverse and inclusive and democratically controlled grassroots movements, especially the ones that are led by the people who are directly impacted by what we're trying to do. We think they're the best advocates to build public support and community understanding. So looking at TIPS framework, we are most focused on societal systems that require some type of collective action and rest on historical, cultural, and legal structures. Of course, as an asset owner, we also have the opportunity to send signals to the investment community about the importance of social and environmental issues. We at Noyce, we've been involved in social investment for over 25 years, and we see that our investments are really an integral component of our overall mission, and that 100% of our investments are aligned, or we seek to align with our social justice mission. So within our portfolio specifically, we use ESG integration on our public holdings. We make private equity investments that create impact and also directly deploy capital to community investments. At Noyce, we recently completed an advisor search with the explicit goal of finding an advisory firm that could help us better connect our portfolio to our social justice mission. So we rigorously vetted these firms and expected them to have a clear understanding of some of the broad systems challenges and how to address them. In fact, we even included a systems-related question in our request for proposal and received 35 responses back. Some of these responses, these recommendations on systems thinking, included external initiatives like United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but also encouraged us to focus on our own internal reporting and to actively participate in coalition and consensus building with organizations that have missions much like ours. So it seems we will need to keep to balance focusing on these kind of external, on coalition building and external initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals, while also creating our own theory of change tied to our internal mission. Finally, closing, going forward with social justice, social justice investing, I expect we'll be working on issues like equality, diversity, fair wages, and labor conditions that tie to systemic frameworks like the ones you're looking at TIP. But we'll also be deploying capital at specific communities using shared ownership and governance models that may not directly yet tie to some of the systemic frameworks. So
that's great, Steve. Yeah, and I think what's interesting hearing both from an asset manager and an asset owner, but also seeing the kind of different levels of exploration that either institution has thus far been able to achieve. So I'd like to also pause here if Steve Leidenberg, wanted to reflect on just what he's heard from both Carol and Steve at this point. And I also would like to remind attendees that if you'd like to submit questions, you can do so using the chat feature. I'm sorry, the question.
Green question mark.
The green question mark, that's where you can submit those questions. But yeah, so I'd like to pause just if Steve, before we go ask a question to Carol and Steve Godeke about what they think is going to ultimately help drive adoption of this kind of thinking and investment, if Steve Leidenberg would like to reflect on what he's heard so far.
Yes, I applaud both those efforts, and I think implicit in those efforts is an important aspect of this whole consideration of what it means to think about systems levels in the context of investment. And that is that the portfolio is a very important part of an expression of the investor's view of how systems should be functioning. The holdings of the portfolio should mirror in some way, as best as possible, that vision of a well-functioning system. But at the same time, simply portfolio selection is not enough. And you see an increasing emphasis among institutional investors concerned with ESG on the kinds of what I would call complementary initiatives that help serve as what we at TIP called the on-ramps to systems level thinking in our recent report. The kinds of things like engagement. So, for example, the PRI's Engagement Clearinghouse has a very broad number of initiatives in which a lot of institutional investors are now collaborating on social and environmental issues, whether it is with specific companies in mind or even with public policy initiatives concerned about tax structure, et cetera. So those supplementary activities are also an important road to the ability to manage risk and reward at a systems level, one that lots of investors have been engaged in for a long time in certain kinds of ways. And our hope at TIP is that by of calling them out, naming them as intentional tools, that it can be even clearer how those mesh with a portfolio in order to help preserve and enhance the systems that the investors are operating within.
Great, Steve. So let me bring Carol and Steve Godeke back in. So what do you guys think is going to drive adoption of systems level thinking and investment? Start with Carol.
Sure. So I think overall we believe that the next important phase of development in financial markets, I think most especially driven by the mainstreaming of responsible, sustainable investing. But the next phase in the development of that will be the measurement and communication of the impact of investment portfolios. And it'll be important that that communication is not just solely based on financial returns, but it'll be multidimensional, and it'll encompass the financial, social, and environmental impacts of the portfolio. That will, in turn, that reporting will, in turn, drive the reporting not only at a portfolio level, but also on a systems level. And I think there will be three key drivers to the adoption of this systems level thinking: demand, evidence, and collective action. So it will be the demand from asset owners for an understanding of how social, environmental, and financial risks at a system level are being managed. That will lead to the disclosure. So, the demand will create the disclosure, and then the evidence will be tied to the disclosure. So our history in responsible investing has proven to us that what gets measured gets managed. So as we demand the data, measure the data, manage the data, it will then help to prove the thesis that systems level thinking is beneficial to portfolios. And lastly, which Steve was touching on just before you posed this question, Bill, was it's the acceptance by the financial community, as well as many others, that will build the collective action that's needed and necessary to keep the systems healthy and thriving. So I think, just to summarize, those will be the things that drive adoption of the systems level thinking: demand, evidence that it works, and collective action by many.
Well, you just painted a perfect Venn diagram there. So let's bring the asset owner perspective back into it. So Steve, what do you think is going to drive adoption?
Well, I guess the question in my mind is really just how quickly the leadership of investors and particularly asset owners kind of come around to this systems level thinking. How can more board members learn about this? How do you kind of bring it up to the discussion at the trustee or the board level through internal training? Current financial training is now just starting to incorporate ESG training. So I think it's going to take, it could take quite a while to kind of bring it up to the next level where we're considering the systems level. I do agree with Carol that the measurement of impact, both at the portfolio and the systems level, will be sort of a very key piece of this. But really, at the end of the day, if you're going to, responsible, sustainable, impact investing, if it's done well, will need to operate at this systems level. So I think that's going to be sort of where we're heading to the horizon.
Great. So I guess I once again encourage attendees, if they have any questions, to go ahead and click on the question mark and shoot them our way. So I want to pivot a little bit to just say, so that's the aspiration that there are a number of things that can happen, whether it's the demand, evidence, collective action that can lead to greater adoption. But let's do the kind of cold dose or cold glass of cold water here. Where are we as an industry in terms of the embrace of systems level considerations? Let me start with Steve Godeke on this one. I mean, you've led a number of RFP searches for other foundations, not just Noyce. Where are we just as an industry in terms of the rigor and sophistication around ESG integration, and what might that mean as the industry goes to try to get to the systems level?
I think now, institutional investors are fortunately beginning to recognize that investments also, have to have impact. I guess sitting on my position as a board member at a progressive foundation like Jessie Smith Noyce, that, there's a growing need for sort of these third-party experts, like in the consulting or in advisory realm, with an understanding of systems knowledge. But folks who can also kind of provide some practical guidance. At Noyce, on the grant-making side, we've been looking at, systems for a very long time, and it's really a critical part of our work. So, this type of thinking, in some ways, should be more highly developed on the philanthropic side. If grant-making's done well, it should be thinking about it in a kind of systems way. I think there are a lot of advisors who are trying to get in that. As we saw through the RFP that we put out at Noyce, we got some reflections on this. We're still a bit from crossing the finish line. I guess just on a somewhat different note, I think I teach a course, an impact investment course at NYU, and there I really see the passion of my students and how they're excited for the solutions they're going to bring to some of these long-standing issues. once they're kind of out in the workforce. So I think, the future is heading in the right direction. There's still a lot of filling in the shading from where we are until where we should be.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I want to pose the same question to Carol. And from your guys' position at Domini, I mean, Steve Godeke often likes to talk about this is an intersection that we've been at that hasn't been very crowded. And I think Domini obviously has been out there in front for quite a long time. And so I wonder, just from your guys' own perspective, are there other asset managers like yourself that are really starting to embrace this? And how crowded is that intersection you sit at right now?
So I would say that I think the momentum on systems level consideration is taking hold at a very solid pace. So, and I think we can expect to see that continue to build. Certainly tips, papers, and convenings have really helped to build this momentum, and as Steve pointed out during his presentation, his remarks, there are a number of organizations that have begun to implement this systems level thinking across the industry. In terms of asset management reporting at this level, I think it's very early. And at Domini, our intent is to be an early adopter and to help create a template and a model of how to implement these concepts on systems level considerations into practice in investment portfolios to help really lead the industry and set a model for others to incorporate as well.
Okay, that's helpful. And I want to bring Steve Leidenberg back into this. So whether in regard to what is going to drive the adoption of systems level thinking, and or what is the reality of where the industry is in terms of embracing these systems level considerations. Steve, maybe you could reflect on what you've heard from both Carol and Steve.
No, I think we are at actually very curious point. As Carol pointed out, I think there is a lot of momentum behind the concept, certainly of ESG integration, and a lot of what I would call intuitive understanding that as the world gets increasingly complex and finance is increasingly influential in that world, that systems levels, these systems are important and need to be looked out after. What that has actually led to so far within the mainstream of finance is essentially the creation of what I would call a niche market that serves those clients who are self-identified already as being concerned with environmental, social issues, are concerned about the state of the environment, and seek a stable and just society. But in serving that market, to date, the financial community has left the question of what that implication of that is for the rest of their investments and investment practice somewhat to the side. There's some silent on that. And if where this is headed is that there is an increasing recognition that these systems level concerns are in fact important and relevant to all investments, then we are potentially on the tipping point of a substantive change in finance and where it's headed. But that is certainly ways off and is something that will require, as Steve Godeke was saying, a fair amount of thought and education and rethinking of the boundaries of where finance stops, where investment portfolio thinking stops, that line and expansion of that line. So I think that's I think that's a ways off, but I think that the just the forces of demographics almost of where the world is headed will constantly keep that issue close to the surface, and will result ultimately in a more systematic approach to this issue.
Thanks, Steve. So what I want to do is, for sure, open up the floor to questions from any folks that are listening in. If this is your first time getting exposed to the systems level thinking that TIP is putting out there, and your brain is starting to hurt, that's a typical reaction to it. This is a very complex subject matter, but obviously, if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to bring them to Carol and Steve's attention. Let me just do a quick double check to see if we have anything up there. Looks like not yet, but obviously keep them coming in if anything comes up. Otherwise, I'm going to just move into the next section, which is just really talking about the kind of, all right, so you've read Steve's paper, so you understand the direction the industry is starting to move. You've heard from a leading asset manager that is coming in on over half a year's journey into this kind of strategic decision making. You've heard from an asset owner that they are beginning to embrace this topic. So what can you do to also follow their lead? And so that's essentially what TIP is about, helping investors move in this direction. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. Through extensive investor profiling work, we've surfaced systems-level strategies, or what we call the 10 tools of intentionality. It is these strategies that they're distinguished from what Steve Leidenberg referred to as the on-ramps to systems thinking. So when you think about ESG integration, impact investment, universal ownership, that these tools of intentionality really get you to the systems level. It's concepts like additionality, where it's thinking about the net benefit of your investment to society, and any number of other kinds of strategies. We also our investor profiling work is capturing the key investment activities. So once a strategy has been determined, such as locality, how are these investors beginning to actually implement that strategy? And it's through investment belief statements, it's through manager selection, portfolio construction, and so on and so forth. The results of all of this investor profiling work is being shared generally through our Tipping Points 2016 report, but also through our online portal and database, which is where investors of all kinds can look at these investor profiles. They can compare and contrast them, both in terms of generating key insights into how to develop strategies in this regard, looking at better matching investors, so asset owners and asset managers being able to better identify investors that are focused on the same kinds of systems and or utilizing the same kinds of strategies. And really just in terms of competitive analysis, what's happening in the market and who's doing what. Finally, we are also approaching this work through events, the webinar today, but also the event that we're having with the PRI of the United Nations next week in New York, where we will be unveiling our entire 2017 research agenda, as well as the PRI will be launching its Sustainable Financial System program. So that's all a long way of saying, if we don't have any questions, let me just do one more check from audience members. I think our panelists did such a great job of shocking and awing them with knowledge. So we're just going to go ahead and move right into final thoughts and wrap up. At this point, I just really want to throw it to Steve and Steve. Oh, we got one question. Wait a second. Let's see. Jesse Simmons asked a question about what are the opportunities to invest with Domini. So Carol, maybe you could give us a little bit on that one. I dare say you're probably the best position to answer that.
I was going to say that's my favorite question of the day. We're certainly, we have a presence on the internet at domini.com. We have multiple products with a variety of share classes to help meet the needs of all investors, from small investors to large institutional investors, and we're always happy to engage in dialogue. So certainly our contact information is on the website.
Okay, great. And let me reframe that question and give it to Steve. So how are folks supposed to be able to follow Jesse Smith Noyce's exploration in this direction? You've obviously written quite a bit in the field as a thought leader, so where can we go to learn more about as you guys move further in this direction?
Yeah, great. Well, at Jesse Smith Noyce, we're going to be publishing a report later this year about how we're framing social justice investing, and also sort of reporting out to the industry the process we went through in finding an impact investment advisor. And you can find us at Noyce.org. As part of my work at Godeke Consulting, we're going to be spending a big part of this year working with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors to produce a new 10th anniversary impact investing monograph. So you can find that under Godeke Consulting.
Great. Well, hopefully there will be a nice little section in there on systems level.
Exactly. Integrating systems.
And we did just get a comment from Carolyn Heyman, who wanted to make sure that we let people know about guidance to help people push their asset managers to pay more attention to systemic issues, that folks can see Stand and Fight blog on Preventable Surprises website. Definitely Preventable Surprises, an interesting website, so check that out. So go ahead and we'll take this into the home stretch now. I want to make sure that both Steve and Carol had a chance to provide a kind of final takeaway thought. What can investors, what can they do tomorrow to really help them go in this direction, or what is the kind of key insight that you want to leave folks with from this admittedly very complicated, intense discussion? So why don't we start with Steve Leidenberg? Do you want to give us a kind of final thought?
Sure. I think that this issue of systems and how to incorporate systems into investment policies and practice is simultaneously intuitively simple and practically complicated. So intuitively, I think it's clear that finance affects the environment, it affects society. How the conduct of finance affects the financial system itself. So it's important. People understand that. What's complicated is that the tools for managing portfolios are very well developed and very sophisticated, and we're all very well trained in those tools. But for whatever reason, the tools for thinking about and incorporating systems-level considerations are still nascent and need to be better developed. So the complicated part is really developing a set of tools that allows one to walk on 2 feet, to manage portfolios so you get competitive returns, and at the same time figure out how to influence, how to manage the risks and rewards, how to influence systems as best one can in a complicated world. And it's that challenge that we need to face.
Great. So I'm going to now throw it to Steve Godeke. What's the final thought you want to leave folks with?
Well, I think, over the years, as asset owners like Jesse Smith Noyce kind of show up to do impact investing, we have our own kind of very somewhat idiosyncratic impact goals or what we're trying to influence. And I think as more and more people enter into the conversation, there's this need for sort of collective action and to kind of have things focus in, and I think that the systems level conversation is exactly the right one to kind of help aggregate and bring together a lot of the intention that's sort of coming out of impact investing. So I think it's definitely the right direction.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks to both Steves. Carol, what do you want to leave folks with?
Yeah, so I think I would echo that sentiment and say, being mindful that addressing concerns at a systems level requires that collective action. So engaging in the dialogue and contributing to the advancement and building the awareness is critical across many investors. So, I think the key there is engagement.
Great. Okay, so just going to bring this over the finish line. Thanks to all the folks that joined us online, and it allowed us to interrupt their lunch today with Talk of Systems. Very big thank you to all of the panelists, Steve Leidenberg, Steve Godeke, and Carol Leibel. For folks that are interested in learning more, definitely check out Dominique's website, Godeke Consulting, and Jesse Smith Noyce Foundation, as well as TIIproject.com. We've received a few questions about further engagement around tips, so you can reach out to us there. And otherwise, thanks again to everyone for joining us. We will be posting this recording on our website, and for folks that attended, we'll be sharing this via email. I think if there's nothing else, thanks again, everybody.